everyone. Welcome back to the Butterflies podcast. For today's episode, we have some special guests. We have my parents, Mary's parents. Do you guys want to introduce yourselves?
Oh, hi, I'm Barb, Mary's mom.
And I'm Brian, Mary's dad.
Okay, so the first question that we wanted to ask was, had you ever heard of TS before I was diagnosed?
No, I had never heard of Turner syndrome before we were told that you had it.
Yeah, I hadn't heard about it either until the doctor called us and asked us to come into that because you're in the hospital at the time to come in and talk to us about some results of some tests.
So can you tell us a little about kind of what that was like learning that I had it, especially something you hadn't heard of? Like, what was your reaction to the diagnosis?
Well, I don't know if everyone knows that when you were born, at 3 days old, you were diagnosed with a coarctation in your heart. When we tried to, after you were born, we were getting ready to leave the hospital, and at our checkout, the pediatrician noticed that your pulse in your wrist, and he could not feel the pulse in your ankle. So he called in a cardiologist, who then at that point told us that you had this situation with your heart called a coarctation, and that you were going to need surgery. So first of all, that was a big concern for us. So during that whole process, you were having complications after the surgery. So when we first found out about you having Turner syndrome, it was very scary because I didn't know what it was, and my big concern is mental and physical defects. And we were assured it was nothing major, but in a sense, I was kind of glad because now we had an answer to how maybe to treat you and get your whole issues resolved in the hospital so you could come home. How about you, Brian?
Yeah, I think it was the same. And, we knew about the coarctation of the aorta, but we also heard there could be other issues related to Turner's, not just when you're a newborn, but later on in life. So obviously we were dealing more with the coarctation issue immediately,
Right.
because you needed surgery right away. And I don't think we are too worried about later on. So we would kind of deal with that as things play out.
Right.
The other is, I think you were diagnosed, was it mosaic?
Right.
And so some of your genes had Turner's, some did not. And so they said, they didn't really know what it would affect. But this issue with the coarctation was somewhat of a common issue for girls with Turner syndrome.
So that kind of leads into another question I thought of, which is like, what concerns did you have for me when I was a baby, and do you have any concerns now about like my health and development?
Concerns, yes. Of course, when you were a baby, we kind of took it day by day. Mary, when we first brought you home, after being in the hospital for 3 months and being a little baby, one thing that we already had was a good, strong support team of doctors. And so we kind of knew how to face the Turners. But my goal when I first brought you home is like you said, you had two older brothers, and you'd been in the hospital for 3 months. And my goal was try to get things to normal. I wanted to have a normal life. I wanted you to be a little normal baby. I wanted you to be out of the hospital. I wanted you to grow. So at first, that was my major concern, and from the beginning, it was. We'd visit a doctor every week. So we had our doctor team. Then we'd visit every month. Then it got to 3 months. Then it gets to 6 months, and then every year. So I think we faced every challenge every day. But my goal was I wanted Mary to be a baby. I wanted her to come home. And even though we still had challenges, with your eye and eye patches and things, um, my focus was let's try to let you develop and tell us what we need, kind of steps. Does that make sense? Okay. How about you, Bob? Or Bob? You're not Bob. You're Brian.
Oh, I got to ask about Bob later, I guess. Yeah, same for me. Focused on as a baby and, how you would eventually develop, making sure you had the right access to the right doctors. And, some girls learn about Turner's or their parents learn about it very early in life. Some girls learn about it later in life. So we at least knew about it right, at least after the heart surgery. And then we discovered the Turner's. Then we had the ability to get the right doctors lined up early on. And so we could kind of keep track of it as you grew as a baby and a young girl.
My concerns as you've grown older, mainly my concerns started kind of as you got older and you entered into school. You know, um, The social aspect, they talked about, the seeing the cues, being to able to interact with friends. You were always a little bit weaker in strength. We had an occupational therapist, when you first came home from the hospital, and then as you got older, we did some more OT for your fine motors, hand and skills, and to
So you already mentioned the boys, my two older brothers, and having already had two kids before me, did you have to change anything about how you parented because of me having Turner syndrome? Like, did that affect that at all? And if so, what?
no, no. Um, it didn't affect how I was going to parent you at all. You know, um, it didn't, Mary. It was, like I said, my first focus is to bring us home and kind of develop our family and um, after your hospital stay and kind of create a normal existence. But no, we did not treat you any different than your brothers in a parenting style. Um, you know, no, of course, you had more physical concerns and things in the boys, but no, we didn't treat you any different. You were just our daughter.
Okay, and then the final question I had was, oh wait, there was one more thing actually. So were there any challenges you faced with doctors or insurance companies not being aware of such a rare condition?
Well, we did have the one challenge we had. We had a couple. But the first challenge we really had, no, we were very fortunate, Mary, in the instance that your Turner syndrome was diagnosed earlier. It was diagnosed in the hospital, and one question you had was, what kind of advice would I give parents who discovered their child had Turner syndrome? I would say to anyone with a child with Turner syndrome, it's going to be fine. You can do this. You just need to listen to your gut. You need to be your child's advocate, and you need to surround yourself with a good care team. And we were fortunate. We discovered it in the hospital. So when we came out, we had a cardiologist, we had a gastroenterologist, we had an endocrinologist, we had an ophthalmologist. We kind of knew what challenges you were going to face and what we were going to have to keep up with. And you always have to have a strong base. That's a strong pediatrician or strong primary care. Because with you, in your instance, Mary, as a child, we moved. So we made our first move from Littleton, and I had to leave my support system that we had there. I found a good doctor in our next move, and he gave me the connections to your endocrinologist, your cardiologist. And it's very important, I would say to a parent, is you have to keep records. Your father and I were diligent when you were in the hospital, keeping notes in a book, anything a doctor said to us. So if we had questions or someone else came in, we could say, this is what happened. This is where we are. So that's why as a child, I always would, every doctor visit we would go to, I had a notebook and I kept track of what the doctor said, what questions I asked, what the test results we had for your kidney said, what the hand, when we used to do your hand x-rays for the bone age versus your actual age. You have to keep notes. You have to be your child's advocate. And I guess that's my concern. One of my concerns for you going forward, you have to remember, Mary, and anyone, that you have to be your advocate. You have to ask the questions. You have to keep the notes. You have to provide everyone with your care what you know, what's the next step. Trust your gut. So that's my thoughts there.
Yeah, I would say the other thing is on beyond the doctor network is insurance and making sure you document everything well. Make sure that you don't take no for an answer from insurance. Maybe you need to get second opinions to be able to go back to insurance with, and some things like growth hormones. If in your case you had that, and some girls do in Turner's, and it's a very, very, very expensive treatment right now, the way the drugs and the growth hormones are priced. So making sure you're getting good insurance and covering for that, whether it's through private insurance or your employer, and then making sure they stand behind that, because you don't want to start something like that and then have to stop because of insurance purposes. So
And in our case, we had to have your endocrinologist help us, support us. We went back and forth with letters to the insurance. That was one of our biggest roadblocks, was getting the medicine. But in your case too, Mary, that was something where when you first came out of the hospital and you were a baby, your endocrinologist in Littleton, he wanted to start right away with growth hormones. But this is where your father and I, we stuck with our thoughts, our guts. So it's like, hey, let's wait, let's see. And even with our, as you grew older, we said, let's wait and see. And it was until we had the obvious notice on your growth chart that you were dropping that when we worked with your endocrinologist here in Chicago, that we decided, yes, it's time to start the growth hormones. So
Okay, well, thank you so much for coming on and answering my questions, Mom and Dad, and thank you to you all for listening. And I think that's going to wrap up this episode, so we'll see you next week. Bye.
bye.